We believe that there's a little bit over 20 million households that have over $1 million. Yeah, in fact, if you take a look in the last 5 years, I think the high net worth population has increased by about 75%.
Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Arup Banerjee. Arup is the CEO of Windfall, a data company that estimates the net worth of every American and does a whole bunch of other things as well. Arup, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thanks, Auren. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited. Now, to start with, why is wealth data so tricky?
Yeah, so, in general, when we started Windfall, to take a step back, we really thought that a lot of different third-party data was inaccurate. And there's been a lot of studies by folks like even Deloitte who've showcased that a lot of that third-party data is right 50% accurate. Now, wealth in general has been...
So even when you look at like gender, gender is probably like 50% better than throwing darts. It's probably 75% accurate or something like that.
Totally, 100%. But even if you're thinking about misspellings with Aaron or Aaron,
Yep.
right, with double A versus an E, right, that could be hard. But wealth has always been something that people are interested in, right? If you think about Auren Hoffman, right, if you look at Google, you're going to have an autocomplete of net worth probably in the first couple that Google.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's an intriguing aspect to most people in the world and as well as businesses. But to clarify, I think, like wealth is assets minus liabilities, right? So we're thinking about assets equals cash, properties. So it doesn't necessarily all have to be stuff that you can, transact from your wallet, but actually that you're accumulating over time. Whereas your liabilities have to be more of your debt, right? So
your mortgage,
credit cards, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we think about the data that you might have around wealth itself, we could survey 10 people on the street today, and I would bet you that none of them actually know their net worth.
Yeah, a lot of people will know their salary. They'll tell you their income. They might know their salary, like to the penny. They may even know their salary, but most of them won't know their net worth.
Exactly right. And so when you're thinking about estimating that and saying, is this accurate or not? Well, even with like one of our investors, this is the extreme example, told me that they had 5 different ways of calculating their wealth. And the disparate, the range was like $50 million. Now that's wow. Extreme, but like, what's the right answer? You probably have no idea.
Yep.
And so the interesting part about wealth is it's not necessarily super easy like a salary to be like, hey, what is that point in time? But there's a lot of different ways that a person can accumulate wealth in terms of investments, their careers, inheritances. So, like take an example of somebody that's worth $2 million. You could have $2 million in cash, or you could have somebody who has a lot of real estate and they have tons of debt, but their property values are incredibly high. So both are worth $2 million, but are those people incredibly different? Yeah. So that makes it even more hard to think about that.
Yeah.
So,
and I imagine you want to be like directionally right. Like if someone's net worth is $5 million, if you say it's like 3 million or 7 million, well, that's directionally correct. But if you say it's like 500,000 or 50 million, then you're way off, and that's a very different type of person.
Yeah, and I would actually say that it depends. Even in the example that we're using right now, of like 3 to 7, like that actually isn't on the cusp because it's still like an order of magnitude, right? It's almost doubling somebody's net worth as we take a look at that. And companies really, they want to take a look at wealth information. And we see this across the board. So, wealth management, that's probably the easiest one. If somebody's worth, $3 million versus 7 million, you have to be fairly precise from a sales and marketing perspective of who you're going after.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're in retail, right, if you're putting in a value ladder, like if you you have a little bit of a fudge factor, they're probably okay with it unless you're trying to...
Yeah, if I'm LVMH, like it's probably, those are probably roughly the same customer to me or something.
Exactly, right. If you're selling a yacht, like a $25 million yacht, you probably want to be pretty precise versus like, again, if you're thinking about Costco instead. But I would probably say that, overall, we kind of see that variety of if you're worth $240 million and I say you're worth $200 million, is that okay? That's still $40 million off, right?
Yeah, well, it's totally right. Yeah, it's totally fine. And by the way, like that 240 million person could be worth 200 million tomorrow if the stock market goes down just slightly or something, right? So
yeah, so exactly correct, right? There could be fluctuations in that over time or how they've calculated themselves. The way that we approach it is that you have to go to the most extreme example, maybe that wealth management side, because they probably have the best picture of your wealth profile of any other company, even the credit bureaus.
Yeah.
So that, you want to take a look at that. And if you can nail that, all the other use cases really fall into place.
But I imagine it's like really hard to know like all this stuff. Like no one, I mean, I can't imagine you would know all the different holdings that somebody has, et cetera. So you're really, I assume it's very much of an estimation on every given person.
100%. In fact, we think about this as like a low bounds and a high bounds, right? So
Yeah.
you have an estimate, but you probably want to have the confidence interval around that as well. And to your point, like if the stock market changes tomorrow, like am I right based off of that point estimate? Well, I want to give ourselves a little bit of flexibility of like what happens in the world beyond that estimate. So yeah, 100% that this is more directional. We're not going into people's bank accounts and knowing every
Yeah.
single component. And again, the credit bureaus don't probably even know that either. Wealthy folks in general also might have like low credit scores, right? If you take
That's
a look.
right. Yeah. Yeah. What I mean, what is the what are the best proxies for wealth that mean? I mean, obviously, like your real estate is probably relatively easy to figure out what real estate people have. Though even there, I assume that's really hard. Sometimes it can be hard to find out. People have nested LLCs and other things that they control their real estate with. But what are some other things?
Yeah, so that gets gnarly. It's actually better to probably think about like what are the worst things that you could
Okay.
use for like a wealth estimate, like home value. Well, what's available out there? Like home value is one of them. And so
Yep.
you were in San Francisco before. Like I live in San Francisco. If you look at a zip code that we live in, everybody's a millionaire, right?
Yep.
And based off of home value alone. And obviously that's not true. I'm different than my neighbor, who's very different than the person who lives across the street. But
Yep.
ultimately, you're looking at home value and based off of geographic location. I mean, there's some places in the country where you can't find a property over $2 million. So what does that really mean? Does that person cap out?
Yep.
No, they're still accumulating wealth over time. And so home
In fact,
values,
they may be more wealthy because they don't have to spend it all on all the other stuff. Yeah.
right, on
Yeah.
mortgages, cost of living,
Yeah.
everything else that you might see. Now, some folks look at zip codes. Zip codes effectively are, leveraging home value or those proxies for wealth effectively. And again, that's just too broad. That might have worked in the 40s and 50s, but really is not good today.
Yeah.
The other one that most people take a look at is income, right? If you think about income, does that correlate directly to wealth? Not really. I mean,
Yeah.
there obviously there is some
Especially on
stigma.
the extreme ends. Like, I mean, I've had years where I've had negative income. Like, I do have like it can really change.
Yeah, I mean, think about somebody who retires. You can go from making a lot of money to just having your retirement income.
Yep.
Well, does that mean that you've lost all your wealth? Well, if you were just looking at income alone, you're
Yep.
probably going to miss that person versus
Yep.
actually thinking about the wealth instead.
Plus, also, I'm assuming it's very hard to get income data, whatever that is. And people may have many different types of incomes that come in.
So, yeah, exactly. When we talk about retirement income, multiple jobs, that pension funds, like all of that is goes into place.
What are some interesting stats about the wealthy that maybe people wouldn't appreciate?
So I think that there's an interesting a fun fact that we do at Windfall all the time. So like I'll actually ask you this because it's fun. Like how much wealth do you need to be in the top 1%
Top 1% of America?
of America?
I would say $10 million gets you top 1%.
And so usually my answer to this is it depends because we're talking about the U.S. population. So a point figure is correct, and realistically, most people actually would have said $1 million. So you're doing better than most.
Really?
Yeah.
Because I remember this is a long time ago, but Ronald Reagan celebrating that we had over 1 million millionaires in the U.S. And obviously that was 40 years ago when Reagan was president. So I just would presume, okay, that has gone up pretty significantly since then.
Yeah. In fact, if you take a look in the last 5 years, I think the high net worth population has increased by about 75%. And that's
Wow.
basically the data that we've shown. So
High
there's,
net worth meaning people over 10
yeah,
million?
over $1 million. So high net worth over $1 million of wealth is
Oh,
how
over a million. Okay,
over a
got it.
million dollars.
Okay, got
And
it.
so most people kind of think about that $1 million wealth figure to be affluent versus not affluent, or high net
Okay.
worth, not high net worth. And so when we look
How
at
many
that,
millionaires are there in the U.S.? I mean, it's got to be. We're talking about tens and tens of millions. I assume.
yep. So
Yeah.
we believe that there's a little bit over 20 million households that have over $1 million of net worth.
Households, and that household may have 4 members or something like that. So we could be talking about 80 million people that have over $1 million net worth. If you're enjoying this podcast, please sign up for our newsletter. Go to worldofdaas.com. The link is in the description below. Now back to the video in the US.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. When you think about
That's
that household
crazy.
level,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of folks out there, and realistically, it's probably like 15 to 20% of the population. So when
Yeah.
we talk about the top 1%, usually we're actually thinking about this from like a geographic perspective. Even in New York, right? If you look at New York, if you live in New York City, to be in that top 1% versus if you're in Albany,
Mhm.
well, that's very different. And then
Good
that
point.
accumulation of wealth can
Yeah. Yeah.
change
Good point.
quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And your sentiment of how wealthy you are also changes based off of your geographic
Yeah.
location.
If you have $10 million and you live in the Upper West Side, Manhattan, you probably don't even feel rich. Whereas if you have $10 million and you live in Albany, New York, you feel rich for sure.
And your spending habits and your patterns and how you
Yeah.
think about life also changes over that time period.
Yep. Yep. Interesting. That's super interesting. What are some other kind of like misconceptions about wealth distribution?
Yeah, I mean, just even thinking about looking through, and I'll use the income portion of this quite a bit
Yep.
too. Like not to kind of double down on that. There's probably two factors that we normally see. One is that if you're targeting based off of income and you're looking at high net worth, a lot of people use 500K and above. Going back to our equation, like that's about like maybe 1 to 2 million households. So again, that's probably thinking about the differences of people retiring versus having
Sorry,
wealth.
there's 1 to 2 million households make 400K and above,
500K and above.
500K above. Okay, I would have thought it was higher because I would have assumed like that's like top 1% or something like that. And then okay, oh, but then there's only okay, all right. So I would have
Which
assumed it
would
would have like a
offset
million households or more meet that. Okay,
exactly. And so, like, thinking about like targeting, what most people do is they look at zip code and income based targeting. And
yeah,
so, if you're looking at like private aviation, and you're like, hey, I'm going to be on a private jet, and I'm making more than $1 million a year, or I'm making $1 million a year. Let's make it an
yeah,
even
yeah. You're
number.
probably not flying private jets if you're making $1 million a year. Yeah,
You have half of that goes in taxes.
yeah.
You have 150K on mortgages, your child
Yeah,
care.
if you live in California, you're talking about 54% of that goes to taxes. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, you might save like $50,000 at the end of the year. Like you
Yeah,
might actually not
yeah,
have that.
yeah, yeah. Especially if you got kids in private school or something like that.
Exactly. Or you might be break even. And so
Yeah,
there's no way you're actually going to fly
yep,
private,
yep.
right? Versus that person who's in Albany who might have that 10 million bucks and is just accumulating wealth over time.
Yeah, yeah. Especially if their kids are out of the house and they paid off their mortgage and all these other types of things. So it really kind of depends on your situation.
Yeah, and I think that this is all fluid, right? Like a lot of people believe, like one of the things that we also have looked at the last, 4 or 5 years is how wealth has actually accumulated across the United States. If you take a look at 2020 to 2024, it's actually like it looks like a mixed bag. There's folks of varieties, but if you look at the growth over time in certain vectors of the population, right? For example, from 2020, if the beginning of the pandemic from March to December, we actually were pretty much break even. Yet you had that shock at the very beginning in March.
Yep,
But by the end of 2020, we actually were doing pretty well. There's a lot of savings. There was a lot of cash in the
yep.
economy. But then if you look at 2020 to 2022, like looking at August to August, all of a sudden the coast actually got a lot more wealthy because people were moving back. Now all of a sudden, if you look at 2022 to 2024, there's another migration in the Midwest. So again, looking at the point solutions, you really need to think about recency of the data of where is wealth gain accumulated right now versus looking at a 4-year horizon.
And there's kind of a difference between quote unquote being rich and maybe a quote unquote feeling rich. I know people that I would think of as rich, but they don't feel rich maybe because they're trying to keep up with the Joneses or other types of things. How does that psychology play in?
Yeah, so we actually, like at Windfall, what we've done to kind of help out with this is that we have our own proprietary way of thinking about your metro rank. How wealthy do you feel compared to your neighbor? Your state
Oh,
rank,
okay,
how wealthy
interesting.
you feel in the state, and then we have
Yeah,
your national rank, right? So
okay,
that's like how wealthy you are holistically. Now, all of that drives into sentiment because if you're in the top 1% in the state, but in the bottom 10% or in the top 10% of your metro, again, that's the sentiment, right? That's the
yep.
New York to New York City example that we kind of have been utilizing. But like, I think about this as well of saying, what's the pattern of where you feel wealthy? Because as soon as you have a wealth creation event, you actually feel a lot more wealthy in that moment than the steady state like a year ago.
Oh, right, right, right. Good point.
And so all of these transactions are actually
It's really
signals.
bad. Like how because if there's a huge difference between this year and last year, either way, you're going to feel very wealthy or less wealthy. If it's just like a slight difference between this year and last year, you might be updating in a different way.
Totally. You splurge, you buy that next
Yeah.
property, you might want to donate to a nonprofit that year, but next the following year you're like, oh man, okay, that was too much. Let me kind of pull it back. And now this is my steady state moving forward.
I always find interesting, like there used to be this advice that you want to have like the smallest house on the lot. Um, but to me, this seems like that advice would mean that all the people, all your neighbors are going to be richer than you, and you're always going to be keeping up with the Joneses, and you're always just going to be feeling inferior and stuff like that. It's like if you don't want to be the poorest person in Martis camp and stuff, like you want to. And so, what would be your advice to somebody? Like, would your advice to be like, "Hey, go move to Albany, New York now," or like, what's your advice to somebody to feel good about themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of. So the example that you potentially like the most common one is Warren Buffett's been in like this small house for 50 plus years, right? He obviously
Yeah,
owns
yeah,
other
yeah. Of
properties, but
course, then it is still Warren Buffett. Yeah, yeah, and I think
yeah,
it's still a decent house. It's just small for a billionaire. Yeah,
correct,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so, like, if you think through where asset level, like in general for wealth, one of the other things that we dispelled is actually one thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier, where the stock fluctuations, like you could lose $40 million. Most wealthy people are not going to lose that much money overnight unless they're an insider and it's tied to their stock of the
yeah.
like the CEO
But I
of
mean, the S and P 500 could go down 20%. I mean, in this year, it's very possible it could go down in the next few months 20%. I mean, not super likely, but definitely has happened many times in history. And so, for most of us, our wealth is tied. All of our wealth is probably directionally correlated with the S&P 500, including most of our real estate is probably
Oh,
directionally
totally.
tied to it, right? So if that goes down, then probably our wealth goes down 20%.
100%. So, the advice associated with this is saying it really depends in terms of where you're at from a life stage perspective as you're thinking about that wealth accumulation. And then
Yep.
ultimately, what are the goals? And so, to a certain degree, the expectation that most people have, right, in the American dream is to desire that you can be a billionaire, that you can literally go through that and work hard
Yeah.
and change your fortunes. And so, as in some people want to do that, some people don't. Some people are okay living in the suburbs of Nebraska, and you actually might on average be wealthier than if you go and move to New York City and try and make it rich. So realistically, I would say that it depends on your scenario and how you actually think about that end number of the wealth creation event.
Now, you said 1% of Americans are worth 10 million and more. I assume that the average age skews very old. Like these are people in their 70s or so, just because they've had all this time in their life to accumulate wealth. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
That is generally correct only because of things like real estate, right? If I bought a house in the
Right.
1970s and then, I stayed in there, then, inflation and everything else along those lines basically
Yeah.
gets me there. Or just because I have a 401k that's been sitting on the sidelines for the last
Yeah.
4
And just
years,
compounding. Yeah.
it just gets me there, right? So I would think that age has something to do with that. Now, if you look at investable assets, which is something that we also provide, which is the liquidity, now
Yep.
that's a little bit different. Now that's
Okay.
a little bit more averaged
Skewing
out as
younger.
you think
Yeah.
about age and how much money do you actually have available to spend.
Now, if 1% of Americans have 10 million net worth, what percentage have 100 million or above? Is that 0.1% or is it 0.01%? Like how's the drop work?
Yeah, if you think that there's about the stats that we normally use is like ultra high net worth is $30 million and above.
Ultra net worth is considered 30 million above. Okay, got
Yep,
it.
and
Okay.
so there's
Who
about
comes up with that definition? Like, does someone just like, is it someone at Goldman Sachs being like, up to this year, I'm going to say it's 30 million or something,
yeah, I think
Because it's a
generally.
random number. I mean, 30 just seems like the most you would think of, like 25 would be, or maybe it used to be 25 and then the inflation made it 30. Like, I don't know how they come up with that.
Yeah, so I think that there's some heuristics or rules that most people use, right? Like the high net worth of $1 million, like that's also
Yeah.
15 to 20% of the population. Is that really the real number today? Well, somebody made a heuristic saying, well, that's 300K of investable assets. So that's the people that we want to target so we can port it over for
Right.
our
Yep.
kids. So
Yep.
it probably was somebody at Goldman who like
Yeah.
threw their
Yeah.
hands in the air. And so 30 million bucks is kind of the other litmus in terms of a lot of wealth management funds that kind of think about it that way to translate it to investable assets. And so there's about 120,000 households that are above $30 million,
There's
which is
120,000 households. I would have thought there were more than that in the US.
But once
So
you
that's like, because there's probably 120 million households,
correct.
right? In the okay, so interesting. So we're talking about 0.1% ish, or 30 million above.
Yeah, it's a pretty steep curve, right? So if
Yeah,
you think about where most of the millionaires in the United States actually fall, it's between 1 to 2 and then 2 to 5.
yep,
Then after 5, it really starts to cascade very quickly down.
yeah. And 30 million is very wealthy. Like if you have $30 million net worth, like you probably should feel rich, unless you have that smallest house in artist camp or something, or
Sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, interesting. Now, I love talking about just like running a data company. When I started Safegraph around the same time you started Windfall. And at the time, I thought like, okay, the need for data is just going to keep growing faster and faster and faster. But it hasn't really played out, at least in our case, that well. Like, just the need for data has been growing, but it hasn't been growing exponentially. Like, what's been your experience in Windfall?
Yeah, so we consider y'all have location data.
Yeah,
We're people data. It's a little bit different in terms of at least the industries. People data. If you take a look at some of the very large players in the space, they've been around for 40 or 50 years. So I think the market,
experience of the world and stuff
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
it's a very large market to start off with. Now, has it grown? To your point, I think that the data market in general has grown, and during the pandemic, really accelerated the need for data. Right, most people in general couldn't go and do what they historically done, surveys, going out into the world, things of that nature. So I think organizations had to rely on data in order to make decisions. Now, when the world opened back up in 2022 and 2024, I think that the data needs potentially shifted back. Like,
Yeah.
hey, you can justify a lot of that. But for TAM, right, when I think about people data, consumer data, overall data that we're playing in, there's so many different like use cases. And I remember you and I actually talked about this like 8 years ago around like, oh, investors used to pass on Windfall because, hey, your TAM's too small. And I was
Right.
like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, I don't actually understand what that is. We actually had a potential investor said that our TAM was $10 million. Well, we're over $10 million in revenue. Like, so it
Right.
doesn't make
Right. Right.
any sense. But there's a lot of different ways that you can apply a data asset into different industries, right? We're doing sales, marketing, fundraising. But even if you think about government use cases, know your client, know your
Yeah.
consumer compliance,
Yeah. For sure.
recruiting, hedge funds utilizing that data for trading. There's a lot of different applications of the data asset. So when I think about the addressable market, it also might be where you're applying that data and ensuring that you're meeting your customers where they need it. We've actually taken the framework of like the data market's huge, but it's really about the activation of that data that makes it sticky and increases the market size holistically.
I mean, certainly the dollars spent on data has grown over the last 10 years. I just would have thought it would have grown much faster because, there's this rise of data science, the rise of AI. There's all these great tools that you can use to use data better. People are becoming much more data oriented. So I just would have thought it would have been, I don't know what the spend is. Let's say the spend on data is growing 10% a year, 15% a year, or something like that. It's probably not growing total more than 15% a year, the overall pie of
Sure.
the total market. And again, it's a big pie, so it's still a nice market. But I would have thought it would have been growing much faster than that. But I've been definitely very wrong. Just the number of new data buyers is not growing massively, given that all the other revolutions that are happening.
Yeah, I might think about it like kind of similarly. I don't disagree with that. I think I agree with the fact that if you're looking at data buyers in particular, you're not necessarily going to find a lot of that in the industry. It's still going to go to line of business, right?
Yep,
You're still going to have to sell to somebody who has still been in the industry for 20 plus years, so senior executives, and yes, they are data driven, like so to speak.
sure.
And I use air quotes there, but like in general, what I believe that most people still, you might hire data scientists, but you simply your domain expertise is not in data, right? So you still need somebody to explain it to you, to make it easy, to actually show you those insights, to connect the dots for you. Because even in the last like 5 years with that transformation in the pandemic, most people still don't know the basics of data science. right? They don't understand classification models or what like unsupervised or supervised learning is. And that's a different thing for the business user versus people who are, coming
Yeah,
up in the
most people don't even understand the difference between a false positive and a false negative. Like they're really, I mean, that's just, we don't live in a super data literate world.
Absolutely, which is why I think if you think about some of the companies that are out there and the data, if if they're getting into the world of like, hey, I need to become more data driven, and they have a very poor experience with a data company, well, guess what? The market's not going to continue to grow because there's
Yeah.
a lot of crappy data out there.
There's a
And so
lot of bad data. And as you mentioned before, a lot of data, as you mentioned, is like maybe slightly better than throwing darts, maybe 50% better than throwing darts, but it's not super accurate.
and that's not their job, right? Their
Yep.
job is to run their business and not actually think about the data side. That's why companies like ours and yours exist, right? To help them out with that.
Now, do you think AI is changing the demand for data?
So I do. I believe that this is to your point. I don't think it has kind of said, hey, with OpenAI and a lot of these Gen AI companies, has our data market like gone from 15% growth to like 150%.
Right. It hasn't lit it on fire for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely not. Now, you know, we actually have our own predictive AI solutions, and we delivered that since 2018. We actually think about AI being an activation of data, and that's more in the predictive AI
Yep.
space in
Yep.
particular. But I believe that generally speaking, even if you have predictive AI, even if you think about like the Gen AI solutions out there, do folks really want to understand some of the underlying data points? Yeah, they want to segment off of that. Even if you get a score and a propensity or some sort of prediction in the future, human beings still want to say, where's the backup? Right? Even if there is those components. And so there has been, even as we built more predictive AI solutions, everybody's actually asking us for more backup data, either to feed that into their own models, so their own segmentations, so their own Gen AI capabilities for other third-party applications. So there's a whole host of things that I believe are in there. And generally speaking, companies want vendors to do that more so than them doing it internally because they might not have those AI capabilities either. So I think that generally speaking, it is increasing our demand for our data, but we also have the solutions that kind of have a fulfilling or flywheel effect to that as well.
How do you think about like data co-ops? And I know you guys have been incorporating different types of data co-ops into your solutions. And how do you think other data companies should be thinking about it?
Yeah, so if I think about how you source data, that's really the biggest differentiation here, right?
Hmm.
Sourcing data for accuracy is the holy grail for companies like ours,
Yep.
which is the input data into the equation to actually have a clean data set that comes out on the other side. That's the whole idea of thinking like medallion architecture, like that Databricks really made popular, and ensuring that you clean it along the ways. So when you're looking at things, even like co-ops, consortiums, those actually have a really strong first party data collection component to it. So that's getting sourced from a consumer like or an individual business person. But is it actually also messy? Yeah, it's tremendously messy. Like think about your own CRM for SafeGraph, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton of errors in there,
Of
like
course.
tons and tons
Yeah.
of errors, right? So if you contribute to a co-op, you're basically giving them also inaccurate data that they have
Yeah.
to sit through and think through. So really, when you think about any of those types of sources, it's about stacking them up for verification, validation, and getting additional signals through. So I think about even if you have a co-op or sourcing data, it's having multiple threads through it so that you are able to understand the patterns and then therefore make the decision, is this actually the right data point to incorporate? Yes, no.
But the core value of a co-op is kind of this like give to get model. Like you're going to put in your proprietary data, and then this kind of like organization you're giving it to is going to maybe summarize it or somehow, and then kind of give you back. So like probably most of us who listen to this podcast have used co-ops for salary benchmarking. Like we'll send the salaries of our employees to some sort of service. Thousands of other companies send the salaries. It's very hard to benchmark. Is it a software engineer level 3 or software engineer level 2? Are they, but somehow they kind of do it with their own magic. They clean it up and then they send you back, oh, your employees are in the 70th percentile, and here's what's going on, and here's what's happening, et cetera. And that's a very useful service. Like, how do you think about, because you've got to give this kind of like, they're giving you this proprietary data. Obviously, when we're giving salary data, it's very proprietary data. It's very, very sensitive data. And you've got to make sure that they're getting value back quickly for giving that in.
Yeah, and I would probably say that you might not necessarily have to do give to get too much. In fact, if you're actually, the benefit is that the underlying data is beneficial, and the downstream AI or the predictions are also benefiting by more and more people plugging in. That's really where you get the flywheel. Now, to create a co-op is a little bit of a different
Yeah.
question. You
Yeah.
got to get those first members in through the door
Right away. And in that case, it may even be like a single player mode, like you're cleaning the data for them, you're doing some other type of thing, right?
Yeah, you're servicing them, you're doing it for free. It's setting up kind of the foundation as you build it up over time. But again, the goal is not to rely on one person in the co-op, because if they remove themselves out of it, then you're kind of, not in a good scenario with having accurate data. Again, going back into thinking about the validation.
Well, assume any good co-op, like no one actor is more than a couple percentage of the data or something like that.
Totally. But I would probably posit that generally speaking, a lot of those co-op models, as long as you're not sharing the raw data with somebody else
Yeah.
for compliance reasons, like most organizations would probably say, yeah, great, you want to use that, and I get benefits from everybody else going through that. Why wouldn't I want to participate?
I've had this business idea that I want to start. Me, if one of our listeners wants to start it with me, let me know. But where I want to get like get companies to contribute their DSO data, their days outstanding data from their GL or their QuickBooks or whatever they're using. And then every time, before they want to go work with a company, let's say you want to go work with Ford or something versus GM, you're a graphic designer and you can take on one of them. And it turns out, maybe GM pays in 25 days, but Ford pays in 60 days or something. All right, well, I'm going to choose GM because they pay on average better. So something like that, just some like very, very simple way of understanding.
Yeah.
Are there other kind of like weird data co-ops you've ever kind of like thought about?
For me, it's a lot of it that I think about is around transactions, like intent signal.
Yep.
Like that for me is so powerful of thinking about it from a consumer angle. And in fact, there are other companies out there, right? If you think about even Publicis, Epsilon, like how they've thought about their own transactions around retail, like it's so powerful and so like very jealous of like what they've been able to build out over many decades associated with that because of the intent that you can actually drive and predictive models from there.
Yeah, that's interesting. That data is just so valuable. Now there's these kind of like different types of data companies. There's like kind of like the pure play data companies versus more the predictive kind of data companies, kind of this truth versus religion. Like, how do you see that market, and how do you see those markets evolving?
Yeah, and I remember when you wrote that, I think I contributed a little bit to that
For
post
sure. Yeah.
Back in the day. And so, when I think about truth and religion, it's interesting. In fact, you need truth to create religion.
Yep.
Right? as you go through that process.
Yeah, like Experian is the truth of whether you paid your bills on time. FICO is the religion, which is built on that Experian-ish data.
Yeah, and I think for if you look at somebody like Windfall, right, we're not even like I thought about this. Are we truth or are we religion?
Yeah.
And to a degree, we're estimating net worth at a point in time. So by the time we've actually estimated it, are we saying that it was truth, or the religion part is that we're estimated that week?
Yeah.
But
I know you're not estimating someone's net worth 5 years from now or something, right? Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, you could. That would be an interesting product. You could probably do that. Like, because like a retiree, maybe they're, maybe their network's not going to grow that much, or maybe it will shrink over time. Whereas somebody who's earlier in their career, you could maybe make some sort of prediction that their network's going to grow quite a bit.
Totally. And that is a super, super hard problem, which happy to touch
super
on.
hard. Yeah.
That one would take a long time to kind of develop it accurately. But if you think through like the truth and religion consideration, like the other data points for any pure play data company, you really need to have that truth consideration, right? Because if I say that somebody owns a boat or they have multiple properties, they better have that. Otherwise, the trust in the data goes away.
Yep.
right? There's no impact to the downstream effects associated with it. So in my mind, I think the transformation of a lot of the companies out there is that if you're a pure play data company in general, you kind of have to start meeting, and it goes back to the TAM consideration. You kind of start to meet people where they really want to be at, which also means the activation of that data. That could be a prediction in the future that they're either building themselves or that you help them build for them instead. So I do see that, in the future, this kind of the thesis associated with it, it is that spectrum that you've put in kind of your own diagrams here, which is you probably do need more of a continuum, and there's probably going to be less and less pure play data companies out there.
And how do you think about, like, what do you think the investors misunderstand about data businesses?
Oh, the fun ones. Yeah, like I think it's this is a fun question, as I've thought about this, and I've been in the data space for, over a decade. I've worked in venture-backed businesses, and I think that generally speaking, most people don't really understand data companies. Like, I think you've written about what is the financial profile of it, right? You might
Yeah,
have high costs and low margins, and then eventually you get to critical mass, and then you start cash flowing pretty well. And especially if you think about co-ops, right? Then you have a ton of additional margin because you're not paying for all that data up front.
correct. Yep.
And so, like, I think that is still misunderstood by investors, like, as much as has been written about it and people have talked about it and, educated across the lines. I still don't think that folks are valuing businesses based off of those metrics the same way. Now, it really speaks to the second part, which
And by
is
the way, one of the problems there is that just the way accounting rules are is that a lot of, like, if you're buying data for most data companies, and there are some exceptions, but most data companies, they put that data that they bought in COGS, even though it's a fixed cost, they still put it in COGS. And so it looks like in the early days, if you're spending $3 million buying data and you have 4 million in revenues, it looks like your margins are terrible. But if that 3 million is capped, and then you can keep selling it, then your margins start to, like, go up quite a bit over time.
exactly, and that's actually the other misunderstood consideration that I think is probably there, which is it's actually not COGS. It's a lot of R&D. You're building
Yeah,
a data asset, and that asset has a lot of value. And the ability to generate money off of that asset, going back to like the TAM and kind of like what can you build on top of it, even if you're thinking about one vector of like looking at it for sales and marketing, what if you introduce that recruiting? I think Zoom Info has done actually a pretty nice job of having their different operating systems across the asset
yeah,
as it's grown over time to say, oh, it's the same data set, but like I'm going to apply it to different people or different verticals or departments appropriately. Well, again, the asset might not necessarily change, or you have to create a new one. And so that is it's something that I don't think investors are really taking a look at. Now, at the industry, I would say, is probably bad at that, because if you ask me how valuable is the Windfall data asset, I'm probably not going to be able to give you a number today either, right?
yeah.
In terms of being able to calculate that. But that's something that I think, we all can probably think about, which is that underlying data, even if the company goes to zero, probably has some value that you have as a residual.
No, I also had thought when kind of like we were starting our businesses 8 years ago, I had thought that maybe there's a way to make a data company winner take most, where you can get to 50% market share, and you could do that by, just getting the best product over time, maybe reducing your price over time, and taking market from other people. But I found that it has not necessarily been the case, that it's still very, very, very competitive, maybe even more competitive than the software world, or at least as competitive as the software world. Do you agree with me, or do you disagree?
I agree. I don't think it's a winner takes most. It depends on the category and the industry.
Yeah.
Like, so, like, I don't think that, like, we work with nonprofits, and there's actually multiple vendors in our space. Now, do they have the exact same product? No, they
Yeah, of
don't.
course
Now,
not. Yeah.
does it sound similar enough where the switching from going from one vendor A to vendor B, they're like, the switching cost is not that high, so
Yeah.
like I'm going to take a
It
look at
kind
that
of
next
solves
year.
a similar problem, essentially, right? Yeah.
It's good enough. And if it's not
Yeah.
that good enough, maybe I'll switch back to that in 3 years, and that
Yeah.
company will still be around. But right, that doesn't help you with recurring revenue. It doesn't help you with, GRR, NRR valuation metrics. And so you really need to make sure that you understand what that differentiation looks like, at least the way that I think about it. And so for the winner takes most markets, like, I believe that it can happen in sub verticals, but probably not across all of the verticals that you might be taking a look at, depending on the use cases. But for me, I think the way that you do it and to maintain that growth in market share is again probably going to the stickiness of the workflow. Once you actually convince somebody that you have an asset or a moat around your data that nobody else can touch, that's when you start to see this really growth accelerate, and ultimately making sure that you do have, whoa, that's really different. I actually have to go to somebody like Windfall because nobody else on the planet, is able to do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I would. If you asked me 5 years ago, I would like the company I most admire, who's been doing a great job in the data world. You mentioned him you mentioned him earlier, ZoomInfo. Yet, I mean, there's just been so many new competitors in that space, and a lot of people going after the ZoomInfo customers. You've got like the Apollos and the Lucias and all these other like very, very long tail of companies. So even they're I think one of the best run data companies, one of the most successful data companies, probably the most successful data company that's been started in the last 20 years. Um, Even they have had a lot of headwinds and a lot of competitive pressure. So it's hard to just like maintain that like core core position in the market.
Well, I think you probably, one thing that is hard, holistically, and probably investors are somewhat aware of this, is that like that data asset has to be good every week,
Yeah,
right? Whatever software that even ZoomInfo builds on top of it, if the data is perceived to be poor, and again, it's a perception. It doesn't necessarily mean it's poor. Maybe
correct.
across
That's
the
right.
board, it's like
Yeah,
95% accurate.
but it's the one thing they looked at. Yeah,
Yeah, I used to do this where I used to be in the B2B data space as well. And if you gave somebody a list of 100 records, and the first five they got, the phone number didn't connect, the rest of the list could be 95, 100% accurate, right? But those
right. It
first
doesn't
five
matter.
records
Yeah,
does not matter
yeah,
whatsoever. So I think that the struggles, and I think ZoomInfo probably still has one of the best data sets out there.
yeah.
That the perception might be that they don't, and
Yeah.
so
Or
those
the
are.
perception is their premium price isn't worth it or something. And maybe it is. Maybe people do think it's the best, but they're willing to go for the number 2 or 3 player if they're half the price or something.
And that probably speaks a little bit to the switching costs, right? Maybe
Yeah.
it's
Switching
not
is
as
low for
sticky
data. Yeah.
as it probably could be. But then if you're, for example, if your sales reps are screaming bloody murder afterwards, then they're probably not. You're not going to switch.
Yeah. Now you've tweeted. You said that the easiest way to get hired in tech right now is to say, "I'm excited about being in the office 5 days a week." And you're a CEO who's doing a lot of hiring. Like, how do you think about like how employees should be looking for jobs?
And it's interesting in our world in tech, and I'm based in San Francisco, right? So like just to kind of set the stage, we have offices in San Francisco, we have offices in Denver, and we have offices in Salt Lake City. So we actually have 3 physical locations, which effectively is a hybrid environment. So
Yep.
even if you go into the office 5 days a week,
You're going to be
uh,
on meetings on video as well, right?
right, and this is what companies had to solve for a long time. Telepresence, Cisco, like all the likes
Yep.
associated with that. So, what I'm probably not saying is like, hey, everybody needs to be co-located in a space at all points in time and kind of be chained to their desk. That's not what I think. Like the intent of that is. I think a lot of the intent is saying in today's world, there's a lot of people that are prioritizing work from home or flexibility, but then you go, well, what is the work from home? And you might get into, oh, well, I want to make sure I can go to my doctor's appointments and like take my care to be serviced in. Well, you can still do that if you go to an office, 5 days a week. That's what you used to do. If you
Yep.
look back pre-pandemic, or if you thought about it in 2018 and somebody said, hey, can you work from home 1 day a week? You would have thought it was the best thing on the planet, right?
Right.
And not necessarily thinking, oh my gosh, this is an evil company that is requiring me to come in and collaborate with my,
Right.
teammates.
Right. Yeah.
you know so for me, I believe that it's less about them coming in 5 days a week, but it's a signal of their commitment of saying, like, I would love to come in, I
Yeah.
want to be excited, I'm here because I want to work on this hard problem. And especially in the startup world, or as we're going through our own growth inflection at Windfall, we want to make sure that we have the right people here that are unified to the cause and can really make a difference every day. And so that's kind of like how I think about that signal. Not necessarily that, again, I'm going to change them to their desks like 5 days a week, but again,
Yeah.
it's a great signal. Now, I do probably
Now, by the way, like, I mean, you and I back in the day, we both used to go to the office 7 days a week. So, yeah, it's like 5 days is like a good drop back from that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I think, to that point, um, there are some people that really like the office.
Yeah.
I've actually lost employees because we did not open offices in certain locations, and they said they want to go to the office
Of
5 days a week.
course. Yeah. It's understandable. We lost somebody like that too once who's great, but they're like, I got to be in the office and you don't have an office where I work.
Totally. And I think there is the other part of this, which I think, is a true statement, which is younger folks that are just graduating from college or that, got jobs during the pandemic, coming and figuring out how to work in a professional setting is something that is actually beneficial to be in an office. I think if
Well,
you're
yeah, that you really are. If you're not in an office at any level, I think you're growing slower. So, so if you're working remote, I think that's fine. It's great. And I work remote, but your rate of growth is going to be slower than if you were in an office. And so you have to decide what you're prioritizing.
and that might be a difference in your opinion also over the last like 3 years. Because I think in the pandemic, like a lot of people said, hey, this is great. But we were all chained
We had no,
inside.
yeah, and also we had no choice.
We had no
So yeah,
choice.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And so I think that was kind of almost that was a false positive in terms of the signal of work from home or remote work versus thinking about like what the steady state
No,
should
I
be.
think the problem is a lot of big companies is, well, you may have to go to an office. So you go to the office in London or something like that. But like the team you work with is in New York and, Philadelphia and in Berlin or so you might be no one in your office you actually working with every day. So to me, that's not like it has maybe some value, but you're not actually interacting with sometimes you don't even know. Sometimes people who go to office, like they don't even know their colleagues that well. Like their real colleagues are people who work in other offices. That to me, that's like you actually want to be physically collaborating with people and you want to be sitting not even in the same building, but ideally like at the same table with somebody else who you're collaborating with.
100% agree with you, and I think there is probably still benefit for that person in London, though, because if
Yeah,
you think about the water cooler chat, I think
that's
it
true.
is.
Good point.
It's not
Yeah,
as big as the collaboration, but we actually had folks that had went to WeWorks, right? They wanted to go to the office. I said, "Great, go get energy." Well, nobody around them was talking about the same things that they were talking about.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it was a waste of time. Now, you still learn through osmosis or can speak to other colleagues, learn about the company. Again, you're just like
yeah.
in that mindset.
Yeah, or you just might wear like, I mean, I wear this shirt every day, even though I work from home. And just because when I put this on, it's a button down blue shirt for people who are listening. When I put this on, I just feel like I'm working. I'm going to work. Whereas like on the weekends, if I'm not really working, I'll wear a t-shirt or something. And it's not really. So there's something like psychological. Maybe if you show up at the WeWork, you're like, I'm going to work. I'm here to do work. I'm not here to like, look at TikTok or something.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
All right, a couple personal questions. What is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
Yeah, so I'm probably I wrestled a lot with this because I've watched some of the other World of DaaS podcasts as well. I kept on going back. I grew up a pretty big basketball fan. I went to Duke for undergrad. I have season tickets to the Warriors and things of that nature. I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan,
Hmm.
and so one of the things when I was growing up, I was probably 10 years old when he retired for the first time, and I was like completely gutted. Like I was, that was the best thing ever to watch Michael Jordan on the court and things of that
You were
nature.
gutted when he retired for the first time. You were like, my hero is leaving.
Yeah, exactly. And so the conspiracy theory there is that he was forced to retire because of all his gambling debts, and they wanted to make sure that his image, his persona, the NBA all looked really great
Oh,
versus a bunch of him actually wanting to retire to go play baseball or whatever likes along those lines. So losing a lot of those years, and then we came back. He eventually played for the Wizards
yeah.
when I was actually there and could go see him in person a lot more frequently. So always thinking about what would have happened, but that's one of the conspiracy theories that like still sticks in
Because
my mind.
he did retire in his prime, right? Like, I mean, he was still quite amazing when he could have done quite a few more years of basketball. It was kind of like interesting, though. I don't fault him. There are a lot of people who, it would go out on top, Jerry Seinfeld or something like that. And maybe that's a really good thing.
Yeah, it could be. Although he came back, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's true. Everyone comes back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our last question we ask all of our guests: what conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
Yeah. So I think that for me, I was thinking through what some people say, which is, if you want to be your own boss, go start a company. And to me, I went, wow. After doing this, after like running a startup for the last 8 years, I said, I like being a CEO is not being your own boss and like clocking in, clocking out. You have your board, you have investors, you
Yeah,
have
your
employees.
employees. You're kind of working for your employees. They're not working for you. You're working for your employees. Yeah,
Totally, and as you
yeah,
grow over time, that becomes even more responsibility. That becomes even more on your shoulders. Like
yeah,
everything else along those lines, it just adds up the pressure, right? So, like being your own boss as a CEO and starting your own company, the only time you really should probably do that is like you're convinced that you're the best person to solve that problem. You have a burning desire to work on that every day, and like you won't stop until like it gets done. Like those are good reasons to go start a company. If you want to have that, be your own boss and not necessarily work. Like my advice would probably say, go be a salesperson. Go into that career,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
3x quota. Like nobody's going to bother you. Like
yeah,
if you're
yeah.
in B two
Or
B
if just
sales,
be a great individual contributor engineer and just like do cool stuff and yeah.
totally,
It's
totally,
interesting because there are certain you're not. I don't think you're one of these people. I was one of these people when I'm younger, but I'm less so today. But there are people who are just like not socially conducive to having a boss. They're just not going to play well in a larger organization, and they will react poorly to bosses. I certainly was like that. I mean, maybe I'm still like that. I don't know, but I don't. I think I'm less like that today than I used to be. As you get older, you're probably less like it. And those people, like and those people sometimes they make terrible employees, but they could make amazing entrepreneurs just because they're willing to just kind of make the decisions and not have to go with the flow, et cetera. So there is like a little bit of a personality test, I think, that's important too.
totally. But I would probably go back to saying there's also probably a burning white hot fire within your belly. You wanted to go do something,
Yeah,
and I'm
yes,
sure
true.
you could actually
Yeah,
go through that. So it has to kind of be married together because you can't just be a jerk and then go start a company, right? You
yeah,
also have to be able to make those decisions and kind of think through them appropriately.
yeah. One has to kind of know themselves, and sometimes when they're 22, it's hard to know yourself. But I think one has to know to make optimal career decisions. It is very much about that person, and certain just because there's like a path to go somewhere, whether it's to be an entrepreneur or to be a work in private equity, like pick whatever path you want. That path, that path is not right for many people because of their personality, because of their talents, because of other types of things.
Yep, 100% agree.
So when you're giving career advice to people, like can you even do it? Because like do you feel like okay, well I can't do it because I got to get to know you first, or do you have some general things to help them, or how do you do that?
Yeah, like it's really. I'm sure you get this from time to time where somebody's like, "Hey, I want to go work at a startup. I want to like, I'm going to become chief of staff. I found a really smart person. Like, they got to go do this or they got to
Mhm.
do that." Like in my mind, I usually go, "Okay, cool. Like, tell me a little bit. Just I don't need too much time, but I'll kind of say, well, why do you want to join a startup? Like,
Yeah.
what are you hoping to get out of it? Oh, where else are you looking? Oh, I'm also looking at Google and Facebook.
Right.
Sorry,
You're not going to startup. That's my favorite. I want to go to a startup and I'm interviewing at Google. I'm like, okay, you don't really want to go to the startup. You clearly are not interested in going to the startup. Yeah.
or they're so young and they just don't understand the difference of it, and
Right.
they're
Right.
passing why next.
Totally. Yeah.
Or like even taking the flip side, saying, "Yes, I'm looking at all startups. Are they B2B or B2C?" Oh, well, half and half. And I'm like, nope. I probably also don't understand what you're talking about right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
I'll use that and I'll probably take time out and I'll say, why don't you think about that for a little bit? Do a little bit more research and kind of think about what really excites you. Or think about a project of what really excites you, and then let's determine what that kind of comes out with. In fact, I think to your point of young versus old, that also changes. I got advice when I was really young that I was incredibly introverted when I was at work, and that I would not like crack jokes, and that I wouldn't be in a room and be able to talk. If my team's listening to this, they're going to be like, "That's crazy." Arup will talk all day, and so like there are different types of also what you find and know yourself. I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier. Is like that probably comes out as you figure out where you really
Yeah.
start.
You get some more confidence or something. It's interesting. I had this person reach out to me pretty recently, and they had a very narrow box of what they're looking for. They're looking for like things in like the space industry, outer space type of thing. And it was very, very narrow. And I loved it because it was like they were clearly passionate about this particular industry. They weren't in the industry, but they had read a ton about it and was fairly knowledgeable about it. And that's the only thing they were looking for. They just want to get into, like, I was like, this is great. You're gonna do extremely well in your career. You want to put yourself almost in that smallest box possible when you're looking for a job.
Yeah, and if you're able to do that early in your career, that's amazing because then that pays dividends.
That's right. It's hard to do when you're 22 because you might not yet have a good understanding of it yet. All right, this has been awesome. Thank you, Arup Banerjee, for joining us, World of DaaS, CEO of Windfall. I follow you at Arup Banerjee 07 on X. I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. This has been a ton of fun.
Thanks, Warren. Appreciate you having me.
And if you're a super data nerd, go to worldofdaas.com. That's DAAS, worldofdaas.com, and sign up for our weekly Data as a Service News Roundup newsletter. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, consider rating this podcast and leaving a review. For more World of DaaS, and DaaS is DAAS, you can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. And also check out YouTube for videos. You can find me at Twitter at Auren, that's AUREN, Auren, and we'd love to hear from you.